Hi everyone, and welcome to our second annual Genetic Counsellors in Research Connect meeting or showcase event. I'm Tadian Yanes. I am a genetic counsellor and researcher at the University of Queensland in Brisbane, and I've recently taken over as chair of the committee from Kirsten Boggs, who has gone on maternity leave. Just to get started, I would like to begin with an acknowledgement of the country, and I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and the custodians of the lands in which we meet today, which for me is the Turrbal Irrawaddy people of Brisbane or Mianjin. And I wanted to share this artwork that I found by a local artist, Casey Cowell-Fisher, titled Mianjin Gatherings. And I think it's a nice artwork that really represents the importance of the Brisbane River for the local communities. So in this artwork, you have the central element being the Brisbane River, which has the outer gatherings of the communities represented by the circles around the river, and the white dots is showing the shared communication that the communities have along the river. So I think it's a really nice representation of the importance of river life for the Turrbal Irrawaddy people of Brisbane. So thank you everyone again for joining our showcase. It's really great to see so many people online and so many people joining us today. Just for some background before we go through our speakers, I just wanted to introduce a little bit more about genetic counselling research and what the showcase event is all about. So for genetic counsellors and research, really, when we think of genetic counsellors, we are very much the genomics experts. We have most of our training is focused around clinical genetics, genomics, and genomic testing, and using this information in clinical practice. For the last few years in Australia in particular, there has been a real growing number of genetic counsellors who are working across a broad range of research roles and a broad spectrum of research. And that could be from genetic counsellors who are in a clinical practice or a clinical setting wanting to do their own research, genetic counsellors who are then working for a research group as a clinical coordinator or a research assistant, and then those of us who work specifically in academia and academic roles. There's been a growing recognition of the diverse roles that we have, and the fact that we work from basically prenatal to palliative care across a range of genetic health conditions. So there's really been a growing need to have greater collaboration and support across genetic counsellors working in research. And that's where GCR Connect really came from, is from trying to build a network for supporting, empowering and promoting genetic counsellors in research. The committee was only established last year, very much led by Kirsten Boggs, with the support from Australian Genomics, the Human Genetic Society of Australasia, and the Australasian Society of Genetic Counsellors. And now we have, I guess, what I think is a fantastic committee with myself and also a number of members from throughout Australia and Australasia, including Suki, Ryan, Lucinda, Kira, Gillian, and Chaya. And across the group, there's a diverse roles from people who are academics, people who are working in research jobs, and people who are clinicians as well, doing research in their clinical practice. So I think the committee has been doing a lot of work in the last 12 months to try and set up educational events for genetic counsellors and really trying to promote the role that we have in research. Now, with that in mind, before I go to our first speaker, I just wanted to give a couple of housekeeping items in terms of asking questions. So we have put together what I think is a fantastic lineup of genetic counsellors who will be presenting research across various topics. We have our first speaker, Dr. Jane Tiller, who will be talking to you about her work around egg glimmer. And then after Jane, we have 4 other speakers who will be giving rapid style talks to give you a high level overview of their projects. There should be time after each presentation to ask some questions, but if you do have questions, please pop them in the Q&A box and we'll be moderating and keeping track of the questions that come in. And depending on timing, we'll give you an opportunity to ask questions in the end. And with that, I will move along and share the screen, get Jane to share her screen. But our first presenter is Dr. Jane Tiller, who is a research fellow at the Research Ethical, Legal and Social Advisor Public Health Genomic Group at Monash University. And Jane will be talking to us today about her work with the Australian Genetics and Life Insurance Moratorium and monitoring the effectiveness of the End Response Project, so the AGLIMA project.
So just to introduce me, thanks, Tat. Many of you already know me. For those of you who don't, I am a genetic counsellor by training, also a lawyer. I was a litigator for a number of years before I moved into public health, and I work in public health research and practice around ethical, legal and social issues around genomics and public health. So I work for Monash University primarily, and also with Australian Genomics. And before I start talking about the issue that probably many of you are aware of, which is the life insurance discrimination issue, I just wanted to remind us all about why this issue is so important. As we know, there are many ways that we can use genetic information in medicine, and specifically in the work that I do, where I look at adult onset conditions that are medically actionable. There are significant benefits in having genetic testing and having it early in terms of the preventive value. We know that about 1 in 75 people, just when we look at these three conditions of hereditary breast and ovarian cancer, Lynch syndrome and FH, are at risk, and we estimate that we haven't yet found 90% or more of the people in the population with these conditions. And just to set the scene, we all know that this is something that is talked about, but a really concrete example of people being concerned about insurance implications when we're offering them genetic testing is this email, which we got from a DNA Screen participant. Now, DNA Screen is a study where we are offering 10,000 people criteria-free testing, so just young adults from the population for those three conditions. And we get lots of emails like this of people saying, I was really interested in your testing, but I'm reaching out to say that when I read your consent form and I heard that life insurance discrimination was a thing, I decided I didn't want testing anymore. And that is a real tragedy, that is the sole reason that people are making decisions about this kind of thing. So a background for any of you that aren't aware, genetic discrimination by life insurers is still legal in Australia, despite being banned or restricted in many other countries. And that means that insurers can either deny your cover altogether or increase your premium if you have genetic results that show you will have an increased risk of developing disease, even if you don't have any disease or symptoms yet. We know that these fears of insurance discrimination deter people from having testing and participating in research. We've known that for a long time, and the work that I'll share with you just has further entrenched that. And we know that to build public trust in genomics, we really need consumer protection against discrimination. That is crucial, and this is now very urgent. A bit of a background as to where we came to in terms of the study that I'll talk to you about. Back in 2018, there was a parliamentary joint committee report that came out. We gave evidence to that committee into the life insurance industry about this concern that we had around genetic discrimination. And that committee, bipartisan, made recommendations that there would be an urgent ban on the practice put in place. That recommendation, unfortunately, was directed initially at the insurance industry, but the government also said that it would maintain a watching brief to consider whether there would be legislation needed in future. In 2019, as many of you know, the insurance industry did implement a moratorium. This was a partial moratorium, which was completely self-regulated by the insurance industry, which means there's no government oversight or enforcement. And that was only up to certain financial limits. So people could get up to $500,000 of cover without having to declare their results in theory. In short, our view was that the moratorium fell short of the recommendations that had been made by the parliamentary committee and failed to adequately protect consumers. We were concerned about multiple aspects of it, partly the fact that it was self-regulated, but also a number of the terms. And so we sought funding from the government to do a research project. And that has been going for 3 years. Many of you were part of that research. And of course, that's the AGLIMA project. We did research with health professionals, many of you in this room, with patients and consumers, with researchers, and with members of the insurance industry, so financial advisors and planners. There's obviously a lot of work that has come out of this project, and I'm not going to take you through all the findings, but we have published a number of those papers, and I'm happy to share them with you if you're interested to read them. But I'll take you through the main findings that came out of the project that were really key for us. The first one was around industry self-regulation and the problems with industry having their own power over how they regulated their own access to genetic information. So key stakeholder groups in our studies, the health professionals, consumers and researchers, said that they were concerned about the life insurance industry's self-regulation, and they expressed a low level of confidence in the effectiveness of the moratorium. We also found that an overwhelming majority of them, as well as many of the financial advisors we interviewed, were concerned about the fact the Australian government didn't have any oversight of the FSC moratorium. So there was a real low trust in industry, and a real low trust in industry, not only to do what they said, but also the effectiveness of the moratorium as it stood. We asked them about what should be done about this, and we found a very high proportion of stakeholder groups considered that legislation is required to regulate the use of genetic test results. And so you can see the numbers there, but they are very high numbers. And of the balance of those, it wasn't even people saying no. Generally, it was a very small fraction of people saying legislation wasn't required, but there were usually a number of people saying, I don't know, or I'm not sure. We also found a lack of compliance and enforcement. So of course, we're saying that the moratorium that was put in place wasn't particularly effective and that it's not a great regulation, but even with the regulation that existed, we found instances of non-compliance with the moratorium, including where insurance companies had asked applicants about their genetic testing in circumstances where they shouldn't. So that's where, for example, someone had applied for less than $500,000 of cover, but was still being asked to provide genetic results. We heard an insurer say that in one circumstance, a company had used genetic results to get to the outcome they wanted, even when they shouldn't. But because there was no transparency, it was impossible to prove that that's what they had done. Also, there's a lack of effective mechanism to enforce the moratorium or seek redress. So because the law hasn't changed, legally they're still allowed to use this information. It's only an industry standard. It's very difficult for people who feel that they have been wronged to know where to go or to get any kind of enforcement or outcome from that. We also found there was a lot of uncertainty that people were very worried about, and this was particularly consumers and patients. And then, of course, health professionals were worried about that for the benefit of their patients. But they were concerned about the uncertainty inherent in the industry-led nature of the moratorium. And so people said, even if I thought that $500,000 was okay, what if they change it next week? People really didn't have the confidence to have a genetic test in circumstances where they didn't know if the protection that currently existed would continue in the future or would be changed or removed. And of course, because it is an industry-led moratorium, it is open to the insurers at any stage to change that or remove it, and they're not entitled to get any government approval or oversight of that. There was also a very broad view that the limits that were in place in the moratorium were very low and too low to allow people to get sufficient life insurance. So anyone on the call who has a mortgage knows that most people with a mortgage need more than $500,000 of life cover just to cover off on their limitations and liabilities. And we found a lot of financial advisors said, I don't see anyone who's looking for less than $500,000 of cover. So this is really moot for all of my clients, because that really is an amount that doesn't really move the needle for most people. We also spoke with genomic researchers, and Tat and her team were actually involved in leading this part of the study. And we found that researchers reported that the use of genomic test results was a barrier to the recruitment of research participants. We found that people said that in many instances they'd had research participants reach out to them specifically to say that they had concerns or that they were worried about this. And we also found there was really poor awareness and knowledge about the moratorium among many of the stakeholder groups. So even among our financial advisor group, we found there was a real differing understanding of how those limits should be applied and what the terms of the moratorium even meant. And this is a comment that we've made many times to government, which is that genetic counsellors are not financial planners, and they shouldn't be expected to be giving financial advice or to be sort of standing in that role of telling people what they need to worry about in terms of their future financial planning. We have to understand what that financial law is. We have to raise it with people, and we have to give them some advice about what they need to do. And that really isn't the role of a genetic counsellor. And so we're really concerned that even amongst financial advisors for whom this is their job, there was confusion and a real difference of opinion about how some of those terms are supposed to be applied and what they mean. So we put out our final stakeholder report on the 30th of June about this project. It contains a summary of all of these findings, and we also made recommendations to the government. So if you've got your phone, you can use that QR code to access that report if you haven't seen it already. I think Tat's also going to drop the link into the chat. But we distributed this widely. There was a lot of interest from government and other departments about what the findings were. And we made two key recommendations. The first one primarily was that there should be an amendment to the Disability Discrimination Act. So for those that don't know, this is the act that allows life insurers to use genetic results to discriminate. It's an act that is actually on its face prohibiting discrimination on a number of grounds. And one of those grounds is genetic status. So if you're an employer or another organisation, you are prohibited under this law from using someone's genetic results or status to discriminate against them. But there's a special carve-out in that law that allows insurers to use this information for risk-rated insurance. This is something that doesn't affect health insurance. It does affect life insurance, but health insurance is risk-rated. Health insurance is community-rated, which means that everyone gets the same level of cover for the same amount. Life insurance is risk-rated, and that's why in that highlighted section, we talk about applicants for risk-rated insurance, because that also covers things like travel insurance that we talk about a bit less, but can also be caught up in this definition. So we've asked the government to amend the Disability Discrimination Act to prohibit insurers from using genetic or genomic test results to discriminate between applicants for risk-rated insurance. We've also asked them to consider whether any other amendments are needed to other financial services regulation pieces to really embolden that and make sure that it is as rigorous as possible. We don't know yet what they might consider doing in that way, but we just wanted them to think about the fact that this is only one place that needs to be amended, and there might be other amendments that are needed as well. We also asked for them to allocate responsibility and resources to the Human Rights Commission to enforce, promote, educate and support individuals to meet the new legal obligations. So obviously, I mentioned before, there's really a lack of enforcement or pathway for consumers who think that an insurer has breached the current moratorium, and we want to make sure that if legislation is put in place, that there are penalties for insurers that breach it, but also that a consumer who feels that they've been treated unfairly has a pathway and has somewhere to go for that enforcement, and that it doesn't have to be left to a body to notice or to bring an enforcement action. This is a lovely picture, which makes me very excited, which is all of the politicians who've stood up in Parliament in the last 2 months and spoken specifically about the issue of genetic discrimination in life insurance and the need for policy reform. And if you told me a year ago that 13 politicians would stand up and speak about this issue, I probably would have fallen over. But we've done a huge amount of work in the last 12 months raising awareness about this issue. We've got some really good support. So those bigger pictures, Josh Burns is the chair of the Human Rights Committee, and he is my local MP, and he's really taken this issue on. So he brought a motion to Parliament in September. Mike Freelander is a very well-known doctor, very well respected in Parliament, and the chair of the Standing Committee on Health. He also brought a motion just on Monday of this week. And Jed Carney made an adjournment speech about this issue. She's the Assistant Minister for Health and has been really, really supportive. And then various other members have either supported those motions or made their own speeches at other times in the Senate or in the House. And so have been feeling very positive about the amount of pressure that is building and the amount of awareness that is building within Parliament House and within Parliament about this issue. And many of you may know that on Monday we actually had quite a big step was taken, and Stephen Jones, who's the Financial Services Minister and responsible for regulating insurers, has released this consultation paper. So again, I think Tat has that link that she might drop in the chat, but it's a consultation paper that basically says this is an issue. This is obviously something that we are behind in Australia in not addressing. Other countries have banned it, and what should we do in Australia to deal with this? This paper includes an email address that people can write to write into the government and make submissions about that. And I would strongly encourage everyone in this room who has a concern about this to make a submission. I know I have encouraged people in the past to take action, to write to their MPs and things like that, but this is literally the chance that you have to write to the government and directly impact the future policy of genetic discrimination. The Minister is incredibly interested in this issue. He's incredibly interested in doing something impactful. And really what we need to do is provide him with a weight of submissions that tells him that it is necessary for him to go forward and do a strong piece of regulation. So that consultation paper sets out several different options. One of them is to do nothing, which is always an option in a Treasury consultation paper. The other option is to put in place a full or a partial ban. And the other option is to put in place a legislated financial cap. So basically legislating the moratorium. Obviously, we support a full and total ban without any limits or caps to allow people to make decisions without worrying about, whether their insurance might get hold of this information or use it in some way. And so we will be putting that submission in, and we would encourage anybody else to also do the same. I think I'm almost on time, but very happy to take any questions if there are burning ones. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jane. It's such an incredible piece of work that you have put together, and it just shows the incredible, I guess, determination and work that you have put into this, and really has become such an impactful research that's really going to change policy. We have time for just one very quick question, and just a reminder as well, if you have questions, to please put them in the chat. Lucinda has raised her hand. Do you mind just writing that question in the chat? And then what I'll do is I'll just ask the question that I have. And then if we have time at the end after everyone's spoken, I'll get the other question that's been raised. You spoke about a total ban, and I guess we've spoken about this as well. So I was just wondering if I could get your take on the argument that a total ban is not feasible, given that it's a risk-rated insurance, and that I guess a total ban will make the given that it's a financial product, it's not a feasible model for insurance industries.
Yeah, so obviously the industry will say that a total ban is not feasible because they don't want to lose any type of information, and they don't want to ban because they want to be able to use this information to discriminate. This is something that has been done in many other countries. We are not suggesting anything outlandish or out of the ordinary, and we have repeatedly asked for evidence that it's going to create problems if this information is not able to be used by insurers. They say that something called adverse selection will happen, which is where people who are at risk take out big policies and then insurance becomes unaffordable. But that is, again, something we have repeatedly asked for evidence. Has this happened in Canada? They've had a ban for 6 years. Has this happened in the UK? They have had a ban for 22 years, since 2001, and we are yet to find any evidence that this has actually come to fruition or that it is actually a risk. This information really is something that people use in many cases to increase their health, and therefore they become better options for insurers to insure in the end. It's a big conversation and we could talk more, but that's probably the short answer.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Jane. And there's some congratulations coming in as well in the Q&A and the chat about the excellent work you've done. So thank you for that. So our next speaker is Rebecca Purvis, who is a genetic counsellor and PhD student with the Parkville Familial Cancer Clinic at the Peter MacCallum Cancer Centre and the Royal Melbourne Hospital. Rebecca is going to be speaking to us today around the next steps in implementation of polygenic risk score in Australian genetics clinics, and focusing specifically on professionals' views and determinants and strategies. So we're trying something slightly different here. I'm going to give Beck control of the screen. Bear with us. Hopefully this works. There we go. So Beck, over to you.
Thank you, Tat. Thank you for that introduction. And I do just also want to join in with that acknowledgement of country and acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, whose land I'm speaking from today. And as Tat mentioned, I'm going to be presenting some of the preliminary research findings from my PhD, focusing on those next steps in clinical implementation. And hopefully this is going to change slides. Fab. So let's start with polygenic scores. So polygenic scores originate from GWAS studies. They're individualized quantitative measures consisting of multiple weighted SNPs, and they present a proportion of an individual's genomic liability for a complex disease such as breast cancer, and have significant translational potential in various clinical settings and different use cases. The use case of my research is examining the application of polygenic risk information into a multifactorial risk algorithm, producing an integrated risk assessment for hereditary cancer. Traditionally, family cancer centres have provided appropriate categorised cancer risk management advice, largely based on personal and family history, as well as the presence of a pathogenic variant in a cancer susceptibility gene. And evidence suggests that introducing other clinical risk factors, notably polygenic risk information, can meaningfully modify an individual's risk of developing cancer, providing a much more personalised assessment in line with precision medicine. And this integration will improve risk stratification and hopefully cancer prevention. In evidence of this clinical utility is mounting worldwide, yet they haven't been implemented in public healthcare settings, and they continue to be a subject of academic debate with worldwide prompts on evidence generation, which is occurring here and overseas. And alongside that evidence generation, we need to understand how clinical implementation might occur in order to minimize time delay and to also focus on saving our scarce research and clinical resources. So currently there's no framework or logic model to guide the clinical implementation of polygenic risk scores for any use case, and minimal attention has been paid to exploring factors likely to influence that implementation, particularly gathering the perspectives of those who will play central roles in that implementation approach, which are our genetic healthcare professionals. And so if we want to really find that framework and that logic model, which is evidence-based and tailored to our stakeholders in order to move forwards implementation in Australia and New Zealand, the work that I'm completing is started with a landscape analysis looking at expert guidance of professional groups around the world on the implementation of polygenic risk scores in healthcare. And I am completing 2 exploratory mixed methods studies with both genetic healthcare providers and consumers. And today I'm going to be focusing on the findings of the interviews. And so I've completed 27 interviews with Australian-based genetic healthcare providers that were either in person, phone, or video conference, using an interview guide underpinned by the consolidated framework for implementation research, as well as a process map to facilitate sort of co-design around a potential care pathway and to look at barriers and enablers. I've completed the first stage of analysis, which is a content analysis using the CIFA framework, which I'll show soon, as well as a framework of implementation strategies. And I'm currently looking at emerging thematic analyses as well. Just briefly, I will show the CIFA. So this is the Consolidated Framework of Implementation Research, as it is the pivotal framework for the data that I'm presenting today. And this is a comprehensive and well-validated determinant framework. It provides a systematic way to analyze the multi-level factors that might influence an implementation project, and consists of 5 domains, looking at elements of the innovation itself, such as design or cost, the inner setting where the implementation is happening. So that's within our clinics, within the medical services, within our molecular laboratories, the outer setting, our genomic medicine and cancer medicine hospitals and sectors, elements of process, and then the individuals involved in that implementation, as well as their behavioural determinants, which incorporates the COM-B model of behavioural change. And here's our participant group. It's predominantly female across multiple roles in the sector, with a range of experience from 6 months to 35 years. And what came through in the analysis is that there are particular determinants that are expected to have a much more significant impact on the future implementation of polygenic scores. And so the most focused on domains are our inner setting, determinants around PGS itself, and then the behavioural attributes of our deliverers and recipients. And I'll briefly show some illustrative quotes here. So compatibility is the most focused on implementation determinant, how PGS will fit in current pathways without negatively impacting providers, burdening recipients or systems. And this quote by participant 21 illustrates really one of the major concerns in the raising of test ordering and bundling, and whether this is going to extend turnaround times, having a flow-on effect on patients and their ability to make sometimes time-sensitive treatment decisions, which is hugely poignant in considering the application of polygenic scores both in traditional clinical genetic settings as well as in mainstreaming. We also did see some optimism, though, towards compatibility. So as participant 14 says here from the lab, we're constantly pivoting to new ways of having to curate with updated guidelines. So it seems a very normal process to be taking on new information and approaches. So here the provider is really talking about the workplace and sector culture and how that culture is actually an enabler of successful implementation rather than a barrier. And what's interesting about this focus on contextual compatibility from our participants is that it's congruent with the major determinants highlighted by professional groups looking at polygenic scores around the world. And so this is quite a full slide, but this is a heat map charting the professional groups such as ACMG and ESHG, their forecasted implementation determinants for polygenic scores against that CIFA framework. And red colouring indicates a high intensity of focus or prioritization of that determinant, while blue shows a lack of focus or prioritization. As you can see, compatibility lights up in the inner setting. It's the second most focused on area, with similarly high prioritization of available resources, such as time and funding, and structural characteristics, which includes staffing. And I don't have too much time to go through this today, but I will just highlight an additional point here about the intensity of focus on evidence base and the advantage of polygenic scores, which appears to reflect the ongoing debate in the field about the clinical utility in different contexts and the call for more translational research. Going back to our participants now and thinking about PGS itself and the complexity of polygenic scores seen as a major barrier to clinical implementation. So participant 7 here talks about complexity in practice and thinking about counselling time. They also suggest a strategy to address that barrier, which would be contracting or accessing more funding for service events. Complexity was also discussed about and adding an extra level of complexity to patient understanding. So participant 2 here, a genetic counsellor, describes people seem to understand you're positive or negative, but that you're positive plus or you're positive less or less positive or more positive might be a bit tricky to get their head around. Providers were also asked to pick a single factor, a top priority, to address for clinical implementation of polygenic scores in hereditary cancer to be successful. So the one thing that they would want us to focus on the most. And results from this were grouped into 7 areas of focus. The top priority was consistency and guidance and thinking about guidelines and a standardized program or model, followed by education and training, resources, and establishing a funding and cost model. Other priorities also included equity, gaining support, particularly from a top-down approach, and also looking at that addressment of concerns around evidence with particular applications. And this preliminary priority setting really provides our sector with the type of data we need to make stakeholder-informed decisions around where we should be directing and pooling our resources from both research and clinical perspectives, and the efforts we should be making and moving this forward with those next steps. And finally, I also discussed with the providers, if we were living in that future world and polygenic scores are integrated into our practice, what would best practice look like in that hypothetical world? And this preliminary model captures the outcome of that question, where we see the outer sector, our inner sectors, both the clinical and lab, and then you can see the text bolded in this model, those elements of best practice that multiple participants agreed on. And what we can see in the outer setting is that best practice included a guideline-driven approach where there was high benefits to patients in terms of medical outcomes and improved cost effectiveness for the sector. In the inner setting, from the lab perspective, best practice was looked at as one lab doing one test, and this test is the best quality test that's evidence-based, with a quality control and assessment in place, and also having that be a NADA accredited lab. In the clinical settings, we see a high focus on patients having information around the test itself and being able to have an informed autonomous consent process supported by genetic counselling with a report that's understandable to them. And also we want to see in that dynamic between the clinical delivery and the lab delivery, we want to see efficient turnaround times and an understandable report to providers, regardless of their background, specialty or area of focus, and that our providers are both knowledgeable and supported by training and usable tools. And what this really, I think the final point really is what this model tells us is what implementation success looks like from the perspective of our providers. And when we're considering our future implementation approach, we need to think about how to evaluate implementation success in a meaningful and contextualized way. And so this type of data is really beginning to establish what our implementation outcome measures will be, what our gold standard will be, and thinking about implementing polygenetic scores in cancer genetics services and mainstreaming, and then thinking about other applications as well. And so next steps is integrating the consumer voice, looking at finding consensus with building that model, particularly the work that's needed around matching implementation determinants, these influential factors, to how we're going to operationalize it. So finding theory and evidence-informed strategies so that we can then make those recommendations and provide a model to think about national rollout. I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Just saying, thank you, Beck, for a lovely talk and a really comprehensive study. It just shows how, I guess, a comprehensive bit of work in the complex topic around polygenic implementation. We are running a tad behind, so I will skip over to the next presenter, and please do post your questions though in the Q&A. If we have time, I'll go back to them. But I will introduce Dr. Vaishnavi Nathan, who's a clinical research coordinator at the Integrating Genomics into Medicine group at the University of Queensland, and Vaish is going to be speaking to us today about the development of a culturally competent framework for genomic research in the South Asian community. And sorry, Vaish, I totally was just speaking to myself before.
All good. All right.
Try that now. I will just stop my camera.
Right. Yeah, you go and stop your. Cool. Well, thanks everyone. Thanks, Tat. And thank you for having me this afternoon. So yeah, I am based in Queensland, and I'm the research genetic counsellor for the SAGA project, which is the South Asian Genes and Health in Australia study. And I'll be talking to you about our development of a culturally competent framework for genomic research within this community, my community. All right, let's see if this works. Cool. I too want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are gathered today, and also want to acknowledge that this has always been a place of learning and growing. So the South Asian Genes and Health in Australia study is a 2-year pilot project funded by the Medical Research Future Fund, led by Dr. Sonia Shah at the IMB at UQ. And its whole purpose is to co-develop guidelines that are culturally appropriate for conducting genomic research within the South Asian community. And I also just want to say that I'm representing a really large group of people. Even the whole CI team isn't really listed on here, but the faces here you see have created some of the work and contributed to what I'm speaking about today. So I just want to say I'm representing a really amazing group of people, researchers, students, staff, and community members. So why does diversity matter in research? I probably am preaching to the converted here, but I want to say that the South Asian population make up 23% of the world's population globally, but only 1.3% of genetic study participants. And in terms of heart disease, we also know that current data and risk calculators underestimate risk within this particular population. So this blue line that you see is observed cases, and the orange line is the predicted cases from that particular calculator. And you can see that with the South Asian population, it's just nowhere near. Whereas with the European population, which is where that data was used for that particular calculator, it's predicting really well. Now, this is old data, but the current calculator that Australia uses is still not accurate enough for this particular population. We don't have ancestry-specific data to put into this calculator. So it's really important that we need to increase individuals who we actually are using the data for. And we need to have improved methods for recruitment because there is this huge gap that's only getting bigger. So the SAGA project is divided into two main stages. The first stage is this framework development that I'll be talking to you about today. We'll be doing a scoping review and consulting community and really involving the community as partners into our research. And the second stage is that pilot study recruitment. We're recruiting 200 individuals into the study, administering a health questionnaire and providing heart disease risk. So we're at this moment going to be providing monogenic results for familial hypercholesterolemia. Jane mentioned in her talk that this is one of the conditions that isn't picked up well in the population. So it'd be really great to see what we find in this particular population and traditional risk factors as well that are clinically actionable. And even though it's for 200 individuals in the community, the long-term goal really is to expand this recruitment and to improve medical guidelines for South Asian Australians nationwide. So I will be speaking to you about stage one and what we've been doing this year. So our framework development is broken up into four main parts. We recruited for a community advisory group earlier in the year, and our group consists of 6 members within the community. They're really active within the community and within different parts of the South Asian diaspora. So we're a very diverse group, and so these individuals are really active and advocate for their community. We have been doing a scoping review, which is reviewing the current literature of recruitment of diverse populations, specifically with genomic research, and looking at the barriers and facilitators with recruitment and how we can improve this. We have been consulting with community by doing focus groups. So we've run 10 focus groups this year within various communities within the South Asian group. And really, again, involving them as partners into our research, understanding the barriers, facilitators, and motivations into participating into research. And we've also been engaging with general practitioners who are also of South Asian ancestry and really getting their opinion and views on recruitment and onto the study design. And all of these things go into informing our protocol, which is for how we recruit individuals into our pilot study next year. So I want to just speak about a few different examples of facilitators that we've implemented in our stage 2 protocol and of some of the learnings from this year. So in terms of trust and communication, we're going to be doing community engagement events to build relationships, create that dialogue with community and involve them in various aspects. In terms of language and understanding, even though our community advisory group did tell us that they didn't believe that English was a factor in recruitment, we'll still be translating our materials, such as our frequently asked questions and our study information booklet into various South Asian languages, such as Hindi, Punjabi, and Urdu. In terms of convenience of participation, this came up a lot in our focus group discussions, and we're actually going to be providing 3 different ways of providing giving a blood sample. That people can either post their blood sample to the lab, and so they get it via post and go to the pathology centre. They can attend a community event, or they can attend a general practice that is partnered with us and participate in that way. Confidentiality and privacy, of course. So we're giving people the option to participate remotely and having that privacy, because that did come up a lot. We did expect that people would want more community events, but it didn't come. It did sound like people did want that option of having it, having to do it privately. And in terms of giving back to community, we will be giving back those returning those results where people opt that, where clinical guidelines are established for follow-up. And in the last couple of minutes, I just wanted to talk again about the role of the research genetic counsellor in terms of my role in this particular project and echo what Tat was speaking about earlier. These are all qualities that traditional genetic counsellors and clinical roles may do in their everyday life, but it's also what I'm been doing in this year with my community, empowering the community, advocating for them, educating them during our focus groups, building those relationships and creating that trust, and maintaining them as well, providing empathy, cultural safety and humility, supporting and caring for them and listening to them. In terms of next year, really supporting that informed consent if they need it, and helping with shared decision making. And again, even the critical thinking is not new to us genetic counsellors, doing this and analysing data throughout from our qualitative and quantitative work. So I want to acknowledge Aideen and Tatiana Yanes here at IGM Group at Fraser Institute, and the whole team here actually, Sonia Shah's team at IMB and the Human Studies Unit, our community advisory group, for all of their help and involvement into our research participants, our South Asian community leaders and our honorary researchers. Thank you.
Excellent job, Vaish. That was a beautiful presentation again. It just shows again the role of a genetic counsellor in research and the comprehensive work that you've been doing as part of the SAGA project.
Thank you.
In the interest of time, I will keep going as well. There is a question there for you, but I'll try to come back to it at the end if we have time.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
So our next speaker now is Sarah Long, who is a PhD candidate at the Genetic Services of Western Australia and also a genetic counsellor in WA with the King Edward Memorial Hospital. Sarah is going to be speaking to us about the work she's been doing as part of her PhD project titled What Do Women Want? An exploration of NIPT for de novo single gene disorders, the ideal test.
So first of all, today I'm coming from Noongar country and the land of the Wadjuk people. It's a beautiful day in Perth and I'm really stoked to be able to present my never-ending PhD research to you. So what do women want? Age-old question. So this is basically an exploration of non-invasive prenatal testing for de novo single gene disorders, or what has come out of my research is that this would be a lot of women's ideal prenatal test if it was available. Okay, so what made me do this? So in 2012, NIPT was introduced in West Australia and uptake was really rapid. And I was working in prenatal at the time and there was lots of anecdotal evidence coming in about how women were doing this great Harmony test and it was on all the mothers and babies forums and people were raving about it. And it rapidly evolved into microarray and there was a lot of uncertainty about how to provide this service among GPs, especially because of the positive predictive values and things not being quite as good as for the trisomy 21. And we did have several GPs referring for terminations based on NIPT results without diagnostic confirmation testing. So there was a lot of confusion about what 99% sensitivity meant as opposed to 99% accuracy in terms of it wasn't a diagnostic test. And back then I could see that this test would expand if we were able to combine it with whole genome sequencing and look for single gene disorders that you can't currently screen for during a pregnancy, especially de novo ones where you can do all the carrier testing of the parents in the world, but you still wouldn't be able to find de novo conditions. So that's sort of my reasoning about why I wanted to explore that topic. So my research objectives were to assess the attitudes towards physical and intellectual disability and specific genetic syndromes in a prenatal setting, and also attitudes towards termination of a pregnancy affected with a genetic condition, and then look at people's knowledge, understanding and attitudes about the option of NIPT for de novo single gene disorders in order to inform future potential screening programs, and also have a look at women's knowledge of current prenatal screening and diagnostic tests in women of childbearing age and the implication for making reproductive decisions during pregnancy. So there's two parts to the study. It's a mixed methods study. I did a qualitative initial study. So I used semi-structured interviews and I used 10 women who identified as healthy, so without any impairment that affects day-to-day living, without children, 10 healthy women with healthy children, and 10 healthy women with children affected with a de novo genetic disorder, current not being able to be screened for prenatally. So if there were ultrasound markers, they would have had maybe a diagnosis, but at the time there was no screening available. And I'm just going to summarise 3 of the papers that we've got from my work so far. So the first one, we looked at women's understanding and attitudes towards Down syndrome and other genetic conditions in the context of prenatal screening to fulfil one of those research objectives. And the really interesting findings were that when asked, women could differentiate between screening and diagnostic tests, but when they were asked about tests during pregnancy, they couldn't remember what was a screening and what was a diagnostic test. There was a broad knowledge of genetic conditions, not only from life experience, but from the media. So one woman mentioned Krabbe disease that she'd seen on Grey's Anatomy, and another woman mentioned a disease that she'd seen people in the newspaper had a little girl who passed away from it. I think it might have been Batten disease, and she was very much, oh, I'm definitely going to have screening for that when I have children. So she hadn't had children yet. And then we looked at women's attitudes of Down syndrome, and that was really interesting because it was overall quite positive, and the emphasis was on society's the issue, not the person with the condition. So a lot of them pointed out that they felt society isolated people with disabilities and that the person with the condition wasn't the problem. And there's just a quote down there: a screening test is just to check if there's anything that can possibly be there, and the diagnostic test would be to confirm. So just showing that they could differentiate when asked to do so. So that's one of the papers from the qualitative study. We then used those themes that were generated to make an online quantitative study. So we got 219 West Australian women, and there were multiple choice questions, scenario-based questions, and a discrete choice experiment. And I'm just going to present some findings from 2 of our published papers. We've got 3 out and another one in the works, but I didn't want to make this go on too long. So women's responses to prenatal genetic diagnosis and attitudes to termination of pregnancy after non-invasive prenatal testing, we basically came up with 9 scenarios which described on the page and said these scenarios could be picked up through a non-invasive test, so no risk of miscarriage. And we asked whether people would consider ending a pregnancy, what they would need if they were to continue a pregnancy, what kind of services they valued if they were diagnosed with some of these conditions. And we purposely made some of them more severe and some of them more benign as well. So there was one where there's an incidental finding was made in a fetus with intrauterine growth restriction, and one where a fetus was a healthy carrier of a potentially lethal hereditary genetic condition, so that their children might be affected, but they would be fine. And this table, the blue shows the rates of termination, people who would terminate for this condition at different gestations, people who were unsure, and people who wouldn't. And I think this shows quite interesting results in that even for the relatively benign scenarios, there are still women who would end a pregnancy based on any finding, so an incidental finding or a healthy carrier even. So that's a little bit worrying, and it means that you'd have to really properly provide good genetic counselling to women before they had these kinds of screening tests, depending on what would be reported. Unsurprisingly, the earlier the gestation, the more likely to end a pregnancy, which was expected, but good to confirm. And the conditions women were most likely to end a pregnancy for were Huntington's disease, Duchenne muscular dystrophy, 22q deletion syndrome, and NF1. So it seemed like these were seen as more severe. And just to clarify, in the paper, we didn't name the conditions, we described them. So we didn't want to give anyone any preconceived ideas unless they knew somebody with that condition. Genetic counselling followed by consultation with a medical specialist were the highest valued resources following a prenatal genetic abnormality diagnosis. And if continuing the pregnancy, then most women identified priority resources for ongoing psychosocial counselling for family members and early childhood intervention programs. So the psychosocial counselling was really highly valued in terms of what to do with continuing a pregnancy with a child with a genetic disorder. Then this is really the heart of my work. So this is West Australian women's expectations for expanded NIPT. So this is looking at, okay, we've got this ideal test. What do you think and what do you want? And the majority of women, so 96%, really like the idea of NIPT that would pick up everything, providing there was no risk to the pregnancy. And they wanted information about the fetus at any stage of the pregnancy. And this is interesting because you'd think that after a certain gestation, people might go, well, I don't really want to know, it's too late. But 80% believe that expanded NIPT should be available at any stage during the pregnancy. And a large proportion of women said cost would also be a factor, which wasn't surprising. About half the women favoured an option to terminate a pregnancy at any stage if the fetus had a medical condition that would interfere with day-to-day functioning. So about 6% of participants were against termination under any circumstances at all. And most were very supportive of ending a pregnancy for medical reasons. But I still think 43% looking at terminating in later stages of gestation was quite an interesting finding as well. And interestingly, the majority of women, 78%, believe that testing for multiple genetic conditions would provide reassurance and lead to the delivery of a healthy child. Some of them thought it might increase anxiety, but it feels like the majority think it might increase anxiety for other people, but maybe not for them. For them, they'll be reassured. So we've got a paper in progress at the moment that I just thought I'd quickly throw in. Some of these numbers I've had to recalculate, but they're very similar. So we did a discrete choice scenario for prenatal testing, which means that we had 2 tests and we chose attributes from existing tests, like when you can do a CVS or a first trimester screen or an amnio, what you can test for, costs from $300, $500 to $1,000, risk of miscarriage and accuracy. So here's an example of the random combinations that will throw up, or neither test. So there was an opt-out option. And women placed a value, it says 1,700. I've since rerun my numbers. It's about 1,860 for the ideal test. So tests that can be done in early gestation with no risk of miscarriage that looks for 100 to 400 genetic diseases, common and rare. And participants who had an annual combined income over 90,000 valued their ideal test at quite a bit higher. It's actually about $2,200 instead of that number there, than people with a combined income of lower. And that was similar for participants with university degrees. They placed a higher monetary value on the ideal test as well. So there's definitely this want for test me for as many conditions as possible. So the reason I did this was I could see this coming, and in 2020, NIPT for de novo single gene disorders became available for 25 conditions through Vistara. It's about $1,300 and it has a 2-week turnaround, or that's what I've been told by private providers in Perth. But then recently a paper came out, and when I say recently, I mean yesterday, I got told about this paper where they are using NIPT for WES. So that's currently being looked at, and it's being looked at in labs in Australia as well. So my research suggests women want to be tested for more conditions depending on cost, and they want to be able to make informed decision. And some of the research I didn't go through suggests that they'd value some written material about testing. So they don't want to go through every condition tested for verbally, but maybe if there was a pamphlet where they could get some idea about what they're being tested for, that would be really helpful. And the role of genetic counsellors after diagnosis is really valued. And one of the expectations is that termination of pregnancy affected with a genetic condition will be discussed and offered in the event of a diagnosis. So that's just a little bit of a wrap up. I'm hoping that my papers will help guide how we can provide these kind of tests in the future and translate to clinical practice. Thank you.
Excellent talk, Sarah. You can see there's been a lot of work as well that you've been doing for the last couple of years in this very important topic. Again, in the interest of time, I'll just move on to our last speaker, And you can have a look in the Q&A as well if there's any questions there for you. So our last speaker is Jennifer Berkman, who's a genetic counsellor at the Familial Melanoma Clinic at the Princess Alexandra Hospital and a PhD candidate with the Integrating Genomics into Medicine group. And Jenny will be speaking to us about findings of her systematic review on mainstreaming cancer genetic testing. Now I'll just give Jenny control.
I'd also like to briefly acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands I'm speaking to you from, which is Meanjin or Brisbane, and that's the Turrbal and the Yagara peoples. So I've just recently started my PhD with Tat and Aideen, and so some of the work I've done so far is looking at mainstreaming cancer genetic testing and looking at the literature. So just a quick overview. Looking at all these different variables in the literature, just I guess thinking about the benefits of mainstreaming. Is it acceptable? Is it feasible? Those sort of things. And I guess the reason I'm looking at it is that I'm also, my PhD is in the PRS space, but thinking about education and I guess the potential for mainstreaming in the future. So as just briefly on our search strategy, it was a PubMed search with 146 studies identified initially, with 37 studies in the final review. We only included original research articles which described a trial or implementation of a mainstream genetic testing pathway in oncology services, and the review encompassed the last 10 years. So first of all, what studies did we find? There were 6 studies of the Genetic Counsellor embedded model and 33 studies of the upskilled clinician model. So I'm sure all of you are aware of mainstreaming genetic testing. These are kind of the most common ways of doing it, I suppose, either having a genetic counsellor embedded in a specialist service such as oncology, or upskilling specialist clinicians to offer genetic testing. So for the Genetic Counsellor embedded model, these were mainly in breast cancer or gynecology oncology clinics in Australia, the UK and the US. And for the upskilled clinician model, these were across North America, Europe and Australia, and a few more cancer types. There was ovarian, breast, prostate, endometrial and pancreatic cancer patients having mainstream genetic testing. So the first thing we looked at was whether mainstream genetic testing does save time. So looking at the time from diagnosis of cancer to receiving a genetic test result. So for most clinics that reported on this, consent and sample collection were done on the same day as the patient's appointment or within a week. And there were 3- to 6-fold decreases in wait times pre versus post implementation of mainstream genetic testing, and that was reported in 6 studies. Appointment length for the upskilled clinician model, the actual genetic consent part of organising genetic testing was ranged from 8 to 20 minutes, and that was reported in 7 studies. It was found that information could be streamlined in this setting, and for the Genetic Counsellor embedded model, there was a 50 to 70% reduction in appointment length, and that was reported in 2 studies. So in terms of test utilisation, access and uptake are, I guess, an important factor and one of the, I guess, good reasons for implementing mainstream genetic testing. So in the Genetic Counsellor embedded model, all reported increased referral rates for actual genetic counselling and genetic testing, and those that reported what the rates were, they were ranged from 84 to 97%. In the upskilled clinician model, uptake was over 90% in 6 studies that reported on this, and this was a 1.2 to 6.7-fold increase compared to the traditional model. And just noting, in the study where there was only 1.2-fold increase, they had their baseline levels of uptake were already high. The pathogenic variant detection rate ranged from 10 to 22% in those studies that reported this, so 15 studies, which is comparable with traditional models. And cascade testing was addressed in 8 papers where they either arranged cascade testing within the mainstream setting or discussed it with referral to genetic services, and 14 papers reported that they referred all pathogenic variant carriers to genetic services so that implications and cascade testing could be addressed. Cost effectiveness is obviously an important consideration. So the most reported variable was the reduction in clinical appointments as being a cost saving for the healthcare systems. There were 4 studies across Australia, the UK and the Netherlands, which identified potential appointment savings, and these ranged from decreases of 86 to 95% in the breast, ovarian and prostate cancer settings. And a paper by George et al. In 2016 extrapolated their results from their clinic. So they found, well, what they estimated was that if they did mainstream genetic testing for all ovarian cancer patients that were eligible, they expected to see £2.6 million yearly savings for the health system. So that equates to about 5 million Australian dollars. Clinician experience is obviously important for implementation of mainstream genetic testing. So things we looked at were attitudes, knowledge, training needs and barriers and facilitators. So overall clinician attitudes were positive, and it was noted that close relationships with genetic services were important. In papers that reported this, so 4 papers reported that knowledge and self-efficacy were high amongst clinicians. 1 paper reported that clinicians had a lack of understanding of VUSs. However, they did refer all of these to genetic services, so it wasn't particularly concerning. And 1 paper reported a lack of clinician knowledge as reported by patients. But in this particular paper, they disclosed that the clinicians did not have close links with genetic services. So this was, I guess, somewhat understandable. All programs that offered mainstream genetic testing, the clinicians had undergone a training program beforehand. And these were generally quite concise with short videos and printed resources, but were found to be very effective. Barriers that were proposed about mainstream genetic testing included lack of time and knowledge to offer genetic testing. But once programs are implemented, this seemed to be resolved somewhat. And facilitators were having an embedded nurse or genetic counsellor within the service, as well as having supporting materials to facilitate organising genetic testing. The patient experience is obviously really important. So overall patient satisfaction was high with mainstream genetic testing. They liked having their familiar treating team offering the testing rather than seeing a new specialist. And 2 papers reported that patients were actually satisfied with the shorter time frame, so the short time to consider the test. Overall, there was high satisfaction and low regret reported in 5 studies. The studies that did report some regret, it was below the level of concern, level of clinical concern. Patients found the decision not too difficult to make, decision to have genetic testing, that is, because they felt the pros outweighed the cons and they had enough information to make the decision. General distress outcomes were similar between traditional and mainstreaming models. That was reported in 2 papers. 1 paper reported some differences, but they did not appear to be concerning overall, and anxiety and depression were low overall in 1 paper. Interestingly, and I guess not that surprisingly, post-test knowledge was quite sort of moderate to low overall. But it was found that knowledge was poor but sufficient to make a decision in 1 study. 1 study found that knowledge was greater in the traditional model, which is not that surprising. So obviously a benefit of mainstream genetic testing is in treatment. So 11 papers reported that treatments were guided by test results. Higher rates of bilateral mastectomy were found in pathogenic variant carriers. This is mainly BRCA carriers if results were available prior to surgery. And this is, I guess, supported by the fact that carriers who had their results found after their initial surgery, they returned for additional surgery. This is also BRCA carriers. And other changes for BRCA variant carriers were that they had BSO scheduled, may have had PARP inhibitors included in their treatment regimen. A TP53 carrier had radiotherapy removed from their plan. And overall, numbers of mastectomies were higher in pathogenic BRCA variant carriers versus lumpectomy. And another benefit was that non-variant carriers could be reassured about choosing conservative surgery. So overall, the review demonstrates that mainstream cancer genetic testing is acceptable to patients and clinicians. The upskill clinician model has been implemented much more extensively than the genetic counsellor embedded model, which I found quite surprising, I guess the extent of it. Both are reported as effective pathways for increasing patient access to genetic testing, and overall the impacts on patients, clinicians and healthcare systems appear to be positive. And I just listed a few gaps in the research that I identified through doing the review. And probably in the interest of time, I won't go through that. But yeah, there's a bit of future research to be done. And just a big thank you to the IGM team where I'm doing my PhD. And thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you, Jenny. That was another lovely presentation. And again, really shows the diversity in different models of care. We're pretty much at time now, so we won't have ability to take any questions, but I do encourage you to reach out to the various speakers that we've had today and ask your questions directly to them. But I just want to again ask you to join me in congratulating all the fantastic speakers that we had. It really shows the depth and diversity of genetic counselling research and the various work that genetic counsellors are doing to inform our clinical practice. And with that, I will encourage everyone on the call as well to please look into joining the GCR Connect and be involved in some of the work that we're doing next year. There's a lot that we're planning to do as a committee, and we'd love to have everyone's support and assistance with getting that more collaboration going on across Australasia. Well, thank you everyone for attending today, and we'll end the webinar. Bye.